What if the true reasons behind the Russia-Ukraine conflict have nothing to do with what the media is telling us? What if the world's superpowers, secret deals, and shadowy forces are pulling strings, shaping this war far beyond anything you could imagine? Even now, 3 years have passed. We've been bombarded with daily headlines of tanks, missiles, and political discourse surrounding the Russia-Ukraine war. But beneath the surface of these explosive headlines, there's something darker, more calculated, and far more intricate than most of us realize. Today, we aren't going to just talk about the battles fought on the ground. We're diving into the unseen world of geopolitics, where power games, covert alliances, and national interests clash in ways that threaten to reshape the global order. This isn't about the war you've seen on TV. This is about the war you never knew existed. We often hear about the war in Ukraine in simple terms: Russia invading, Ukraine resisting, and the West supporting Kyiv. It's a narrative that fits neatly into the headlines, but it's missing critical layers. Why did Russia invade? What are its real objectives? And what is the West's role in all of this? As we dig deeper, we uncover a far more complicated story, a story of secret deals, long-standing rivalries, and an unpredictable future for global politics. This is the side of the war that the media, for the most part, has failed to report. Let's begin with the core of this conflict, the relationship between Russia and Ukraine. Historically, this relationship has always been one of deep interconnection, but it is also fraught with tensions. From the times of the Tsarist Empire to the Soviet Union, Russia has viewed Ukraine as both a strategic buffer zone and a culturally significant area. But that dynamic started to shift after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. The breakup of the USSR resulted in the emergence of independent states, including Ukraine. For many Ukrainians, independence was a liberation, a chance to forge their own identity. But for Russia, this independence was a challenge. The loss of Ukraine meant not just the loss of territory, but the loss of influence over the region, a critical part of Russia's historical and strategic ambitions. The fact that Ukraine was now an independent nation meant that Russia had to reassess its role on the world stage. In the early years following Ukraine's independence, Russia's relationship with Kyiv was largely defined by cooperation and occasional tension. But as the years progressed, Ukraine began to look more towards the West, seeking alliances with European nations and showing increasing interest in joining Western institutions like NATO and the European Union. This shift, however, was seen as a betrayal by Russia. In Russian eyes, Ukraine was not simply a neighbor. It was part of their sphere of influence, a buffer zone between Russia and the West. Ukraine's potential NATO membership was a red line for Russia, and Putin made this abundantly clear. So, when Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, the world was left to wonder, what exactly was Russia trying to achieve? On the surface, the answer seemed simple. Russia wanted to prevent NATO from encroaching any further into its sphere. Crimea was strategically important. It housed Russia's Black Sea Fleet and was a crucial naval gateway. But this invasion was more than just about securing military assets. Crimea was a symbolic statement of power and control, a reaffirmation that Russia would not tolerate losing its influence over the region. However, Russia's ambitions didn't stop at Crimea. The conflict in eastern Ukraine, particularly in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions, was a continuation of Russia's efforts to destabilize Ukraine. By supporting separatist movements in these regions, Russia aimed to further fragment Ukraine and prevent it from integrating into Western institutions. But even as Russia stoked unrest in these regions, the West responded. first with sanctions and later with military aid to Ukraine. At the heart of this conflict, though, is not just territorial control or national sovereignty. It is the ideological divide that stretches back to the Cold War. The fall of the Soviet Union and the subsequent rise of NATO as the dominant military alliance in Europe posed a direct challenge to Russia's power. NATO was initially formed to counter Soviet influence in Europe, but after the USSR dissolved, NATO's role morphed. It wasn't just a defense alliance, it became a means of projecting power and expanding Western influence into former Soviet territories. For Russia, NATO's eastward expansion is seen as a betrayal of promises made after the Cold War. But more than that, it represents a direct threat to Russia's historical position in Europe. While NATO's expansion was undoubtedly one of the key provocations for Russia's aggression, it's not the only factor at play here. Another critical issue is the geopolitical competition over resources, particularly energy. Ukraine, as a major transit country for Russian natural gas to Europe, plays a vital role in Russia's ability to maintain its economic influence over the continent. Gas pipelines running through Ukraine have historically been one of Russia's most powerful tools for exerting pressure on Europe. Any shift in control over these pipelines, whether through Ukraine's alignment with the West or through direct conflict, has massive consequences not only for Russia, but for Europe as a whole. The intersection of energy and geopolitics is key to understanding Russia's moves in the region. With the rise of alternative energy sources and Europe's ongoing efforts to reduce its dependency on Russian energy, Ukraine's energy significance cannot be understated. The West's support for Ukraine in part serves to counterbalance Russia's energy dominance and lessen Europe's reliance on Russian gas. In this way, the war in Ukraine is not just a conflict between two countries. It is a battle for control over energy resources, a struggle for economic and strategic leverage that goes far beyond national borders. But beyond energy lies the broader competition for influence in Central and Eastern Europe. The war in Ukraine in this sense is also part of a larger struggle for control of the region, with Russia aiming to reassert its dominance and prevent the further encroachment of Western powers into what it considers its backyard. The West, on the other hand, has been positioning itself to extend its influence over the entire region. This clash of interests, fueled by both strategic and economic considerations, forms the backdrop to the ongoing conflict. The involvement of external powers like the United States and China complicates matters further. The United States has long been a key player in the global geopolitical order, and its involvement in the Ukraine conflict is driven by several factors. First, the United States sees Russia's aggression as a direct challenge to the post-Cold War world order. By supporting Ukraine, the West is signaling that territorial aggression will not be tolerated and that international borders must be respected. But beyond this, the United States also has its own strategic interests in the region. The United States wants to prevent Russia from reasserting itself as a regional hegemon and challenging the stability of Europe. At the same time, China's role in the conflict is far more nuanced. While China has not directly intervened in the war, its partnership with Russia has been growing in recent years. Both countries share a common interest in challenging United States dominance on the global stage. As the United States seeks to isolate Russia through sanctions and diplomatic pressure, China has emerged as a key economic partner for Russia, particularly in the energy sector. China has been purchasing more Russian oil and gas, providing Russia with a much-needed economic lifeline in the face of Western sanctions. China's strategic interest in the Ukraine conflict is rooted in its broader ambitions. By strengthening its relationship with Russia, China is positioning itself as a counterweight to the United States in the global geopolitical order. At the same time, China has been expanding its influence in Central Asia and Eastern Europe through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, further complicating the region's geopolitics. This brings us to another critical component of the conflict, the economic implications. The war in Ukraine has had a profound impact on global markets, particularly in the energy and food sectors. The disruption of Ukrainian grain exports has had a ripple effect on food prices around the world, particularly in the Middle East, Africa, and Asia, where many countries rely on Ukrainian wheat. The energy crisis that has followed the war, fueled by sanctions on Russia and disruptions in the global supply chain, has further exacerbated global inflation and economic instability. In Europe, the economic consequences of the war are particularly stark. As the EU seeks to reduce its reliance on Russian energy, it faces the challenge of transitioning to alternative sources of energy while managing the economic fallout from rising energy prices. The war has exposed the vulnerability of Europe's energy infrastructure and the fragility of its supply chains. The long-term consequences of these disruptions could reshape Europe's economic future for decades to come. But the global ramifications of this war are not limited to energy and food security. The conflict in Ukraine has sparked a new wave of militarization across Europe, with countries like Sweden and Finland re-evaluating their security policies and seeking to join NATO. The war has also prompted a rethinking of defense spending and military readiness across the West. NATO countries are increasing their defense budgets and strengthening their military alliances in response to Russia's actions. The war is also reshaping global trade dynamics. As countries seek to diversify their energy sources and supply chains, new economic alliances are being forged. China's increasing involvement in Europe, its growing influence in Central Asia, and its strategic partnership with Russia are all contributing to a shift in the global balance of power. The outcome of the Ukraine war will likely have long-lasting effects on these trade dynamics, potentially marking the beginning of a new era in global economics. Finally, we must consider the human cost of the war. While the geopolitical and economic dimensions are critical to understanding the conflict, we cannot ignore the human toll it has taken. Thousands of lives have been lost, millions have been displaced, and entire communities have been destroyed. The war has caused untold suffering, and its effects will be felt for generations to come. But the broader lesson is this: in the world of geopolitics, the lives of ordinary people are often pawns in a much larger game. Here's the truth: the Russia-Ukraine conflict is not simply a territorial dispute. It's a war that encapsulates the struggle for global power. It's a high-stakes game where every move is calculated, where alliances are forged and broken behind closed doors, and where economic leverage and military might intersect in ways that will determine the future of nations. The true forces behind this war aren't always visible. They're the deals made in boardrooms, the back-channel conversations between world leaders, and the decisions made based on resources and influence. To understand the Russia-Ukraine war fully, you must look beyond the obvious. The story isn't just about two countries clashing over land, it's about the hidden powers shaping this conflict. The West, Russia, China, and even lesser-known players are all part of a grand geopolitical strategy that has been unfolding for decades. This is a war of influence, resources, and control, and its outcome will have repercussions that echo far beyond Eastern Europe. The true motivations, the hidden players, and the long-term consequences are still unfolding, but one thing is certain: this war is far from over, and its impact will be felt for generations to come. If you want to learn more about how global politics shape our world, make sure to watch the next video.